to our hosts. And maybe we'll see a few more people come in and join us as we go through this morning. But for the first session this morning, for this final plenary, it's absolutely on topic for our theme for the meeting of sustainable science, and very much focusing on the wonderful ecosystem that we have here in Costa Rica. It might be slightly damp this week, but that's why it's so beautiful and green and luscious. So this morning we have data for the environment, connecting and governing data for sustainability. And we have two magnificent speakers. You're not going to need a moderator at all. We'll let them get on with it. So tempted to let them give each other's bios, because when we saw the chemistry and the magic in that discussion yesterday afternoon, I could just step out of the way. But I won't for the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a presentation from each of our speakers, and then we'll sit together, a couple of questions from me just to get the ball rolling, and then it's over to you with your questions for our wonderful speakers. So we're going to start with Owen. So Professor Owen Nevin, CEO of the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. I don't need to say that again, that's now WOBSE. Owen is an experienced conservation biologist and research leader with almost 30 years experience in the conservation and management of large carnivores globally. He has extensive experience in senior leadership, in higher education and research, and significant roles across the globe, including head of the National School of Forestry in the UK and Associate Vice-Chancellor at Central Queensland University over in Australia. So Owen currently leads the WOBSE, a collaborative research joint venture established to address the complex challenges of ensuring both environmental and economic sustainability in Western Australia. And so one of the challenges that WOBSE is currently addressing is connecting government, research, and industry data to inform better decision making. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to Owen now to tell us a bit more about that work. Thanks, Owen.
Thanks, Rosie. And it's a great pleasure to be able to join you to present today. And it's been great to be involved in the plenary and the conference so far. From my introduction, you'll see that I'm a bit of a fraud in the data space. I'm actually a biologist, so we'll try and avoid the really technical questions, but I will talk you through the work that we're doing. WOBSE is an unusual organization in that we are a joint venture of 4 universities, 4 government departments, the Commonwealth or federal government's science agency, CSIRO, and the West Australian Museum. So we really represent all of the research capacity that exists in the state of Western Australia. Western Australia is also kind of a strange case in that on most scales, Western Australia you'd be thinking about country scale, whereas for us, it's just a state within the country. So Western Australia is about somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent of Australia, and it's about the size of Western Europe. So when we do regional projects, we do them on a large scale. It's also a state which is highly resource dependent. So major exports from the mineral sector and the agricultural sector, very dependent on its environment, and really diverse assemblages of species. So one of the global biodiversity hotspots, the regions where biodiversity is abundant and threatened. So we were established to be in the middle of that bubble there between government, research, community, regulators, industry, funders often, and dealing with what are termed the wicked problems. It's an overused term, but really in our case, it is a genuine use of that terminology, wicked problems. you pull one lever and a whole bunch of other things happen. The environment will do that to you. And so we're set a number of challenges, and one of them is in the data space. And so I'm going to take you on what's been a 7-year journey. It's still a work in progress, and walk through what we've been doing, what we are doing, and what we hope to achieve, and hopefully inspire some of you and share some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. So a few years ago, the federal government, Commonwealth government in Australia, did a review of their environment protection legislation called the Samuels Review, and Samuels highlighted the real challenge that there was in having a coherent environmental data supply chain nationally, and really looking at data is collected, but how do we get to put it to use? And where is that data collected, and where does it go? And joining that up into, this figure makes it seem like a really neat supply chain. And in his report, he has a sort of a spaghetti diagram of chaos that is the current state. And that's also the case in Western Australia. So that's just flipping that same diagram on the side. We worked something we call the SAFE framework, a shared analytic framework for the environment. And those layers in that framework are the same points that are actually in that Samuels review in the supply chain of data. There's a really important aspect to thinking about data supply chains in this way, because this framework allows people to find their organization. If the text was larger, you'd be able to see descriptors in there that would match to the sorts of organizations you're running. Are you a curator of data? Are you a generator of data? Are you an integrator of data sets? What is the role that you're there? No single organization provides an end-to-end in the environmental data space in Western Australia. The other aspect that we really found sort of a fundamental awakening was the volume of data that's actually collected by industry, not research, not government. And in Western Australia, we've done this analysis in the marine space and in the terrestrial space, and found that it's outweighing government data tenfold, the amount of data that's generated by industry. And it doesn't flow through into our normal research environments, our shared data sets. It sits with those proponents. So we set out on a journey to try and capture some of that data. And the first step along that way was back in 2018, the establishment of the Index of Biodiversity Surveys and Assessments. So now the environmental regulator in the state requires people to submit a data set that supports their environmental impact statement. Previously, you just submitted the statement and kept the data. It gets dusty on someone's shelf, and the decision gets made. We also worked through that into the marine space. So now around $100 million of survey effort that was being lost is being captured in those submissions each year. So when I talk to a minister, I sort of pull that all together and go, Minister, over 10 years, we're going to generate $1 billion data asset. And good news, it's not costing you anything because it's already work that's being done. It's a good way to win friends and influence people, give them $1 billion data set for free. It's not for free, obviously, people are already paying for it, but it's for the end user, it's there. That then supports the ability to make decisions. But what we realized along the way was that while there's a requirement to submit that data, that comes at the end of the decision pathway. So at the end of the decision pathway, when you've already made your plan, you submit your data and your plan, and the regulator goes, not good enough because other people have submitted their data and their plans, and you haven't seen that. You haven't had access to that because that's their private data. So to really actually get benefit in terms of environmental outcomes and speeding up the process, you need to move that point at which people can share data further back in the process so they can make better decisions. So that's when we start to think about how can we sit right at the top of that supply chain in the analyze and put to use space with an enabling tool that allows people to share private data, integrate it with public data and research data to make better decisions. So in a triumph of confusing acronyms, we went from our SAFE framework to the SEAF Shared Environmental Analytics Facility. Same letters, different order, different thing. The Shared Environmental Analytics Facility really designed and intended to do what it says. It's shared, it's a common platform that we can share across regions. It's for environmental analytics, and it's to facilitate outcomes. So we're not becoming one database to rule them all. We want all the data and we're going to hold it. We're not becoming one analytical tool that makes your decision. We can provide decision support, but not the decision making. So we're facilitating really in that banking sense of a facility that enables rather than a facility like a building. So what does SEAF look like? SEAF is an independent entity. So we're an unincorporated joint venture. So we're independent, funded by government, but operated independently. And we currently run the SEAF program. Central hub with regional spokes. So shared central services with bespoke regional modeling and capability in those areas. And it's built on a bespoke platform, but it's a platform that we've built using commercial cloud. And one of the things that has been a real breakthrough for us is understanding that for many of our government, regulator, and industry partners, there's a trust barrier that they need to come over to put their data into a platform which is kind of funky. We're a small organization. We've created this crazy thing. Why would I give my data to that? Is it safe? You know, well, actually, our global commercial partner here already provides your cloud services. So actually, you're not moving it. It's just a bit of code that links it together. And the chief information officers go, oh, well, that's okay. So SEAF actually sits on the Azure cloud, and it sits in the tenancy of the environmental regulator for the state. So it's very secure and very trusted because that's where all this data will end up and where the decision makers actually sit. So there's a legal framework that sits around it to support it. Quite different from the research endeavor where we're in a different space. One of the other aspects of innovation within this portal and within this platform is that ability to move sharing earlier and earlier in the journey. So there are legal, cultural, and many other impediments to companies sharing private, commercially sensitive data with each other. In one of our pilots, we're working with multiple agencies, including defense, where they're not going to share their data publicly. It's just never going to happen. So how do you get that into a model? So the SEAF platform has allowed us to have a bridge between fully private, fully public and open. And in an ideal world, it's environmental data. It's wonderful. It's public good. It should be over here, but it's private. So how do we get it somewhere closer? And we've developed with partners the ability to encrypt data and share encrypted data into models. So the models can run, and the modeling sees all the data, but the modeler doesn't. So that gives people the ability to share sensitive data, data that there are legal barriers to sharing. It's another version of the same sort of data flow and structure where you can see the concept of multiple zones for multiple parties working in a region. So they're sharing private and open data into collaborative and encrypted zones. Much of this data does eventually become public. It moves through that chain. Some of it will never become public. And that's not our choice to make. That's the data owner's choice to make. And they can move it through the system using it as they see fit. They will then move it to a more public space. So the SEAF project has moved through from concept into pilots, and we're now piloting this notion of translating science, knowledge, and data into streamlined decisions. We've been joined by many partners along the way, notably Rosie's organization, ARDC, a critical partner in moving into the pilot phase of this project and enabling us to leverage Commonwealth funding, industry funding, and a number of global partners along the way into the delivery of 2 pilot examples of how this system works for a region. We've chosen 2 regions in Western Australia that are environmentally sensitive, economically valuable, and highly contested. So one region, the Pilbara, we talk about it as a region. It's about the size of France, maybe a little bit larger. Generates about 40% of the export revenue for Australia every year through the mining activities in the region. So highly important to the national economy. Very contested in terms of Indigenous land rights and biodiversity. And so a really good opportunity to really test this system. And the other example in Westport, which is a Coburn Sound, a development of a new port facility just outside the capital city of Perth in Western Australia, where we have a new port being developed, 2 desalination plants, a new nuclear submarine base, and many other projects, all overlapping in a small space. So the structure of SAFE, I said before, that hub and spoke approach, it's designed to be robust, based on good science, repeatable. You can go back in there and verify. One of the big challenges in environmental decision-making is the right to appeal. So you need to be able to go back and demonstrate the outcome. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be cost-effective. We worked through the costings, and it's not a cheap exercise, but it has a 16-to-1 return on investment. So we're looking at regions where in the Pilbara at the moment, there's around $170 billion of investment in the pipeline for capital investment. We made a very conservative estimate that working in a shared platform could save 3 months. That's a $1.6 billion return on investment. So we are able to go to our partners with quite large and ambitious requests, but then come back saying, really, your $100 million is going to be well spent, trust me. Or more correctly, trust the economic analysis that's been done by our global respected partner in PwC. So you've got that sustainability. It's doing work which has a return. It's not just a cost. It's scalable. The hub and spoke model is designed to allow us to implement this in regions on a regional scale and build up an increasing picture of the environment. And it's working in both marine and terrestrial spaces. I've mentioned that secure public and private journey, and it's operationalized. It's bringing the best science to inform the best decisions. Excuse me. So Coburn Sound, the Safe Spoken Coburn Sound, is our more advanced pilot with our partners in the West Australian Marine Science Institute, another large acronym for Rosie. We're WOBSI, the Biodiversity Science Institute. They're WOMSI, the Marine Science Institute. They've been working on pulling together a science package to get that robust science that's needed to underpin the decision making. So there's been around $20 million invested in new science in that environment, supporting the modeling, everything from integrated ecosystems, hydrodynamics, noise, coastal processes. You can see them there, the different themes that they've worked through. And then those have been integrated in the SEAF platform with existing data sets, private data sets from industry, and then future scenario data sets. So the basis of design for the new port, the basis of design for the submarine base. And then that allows you to pull together models that can look at impacts of all these different projects happening in the same space at the same time. In 2021, the legislation in West Australia changed such that in approving environmentally impactful projects, the government has to consider and the proponents have to consider what's called cumulative impact. So they have to have an understanding of everything that's going on, but how can one proponent have that without seeing everyone else's data? So the CEIF platform really addresses that to be able to allow people to bring their data together in a commercially sensitive, secure environment, and then have an understanding of cumulative. Coburn Sound's a great example of why that's important for proponents, because in that sound, the port is being developed by a state-owned corporation. The desalination plant is a state-owned corporation. The defense base is run by the government. So in every case, it's the government making some statement about what the impact is, but it's 3 different projects that don't see each other's data. So if the government makes 3 statements that are all different, headline in the newspaper, sharing that data together and being able to have one version of impact is a real step change in moving forward. So it supports that industry growth. It supports an ongoing sort of state of environment and baseline reporting as we go forward. So just reiterating that robust, repeatable, and sustainable. The robust, investing in the new science to allow the modeling to be done. The repeatable, it's operational, it's bringing those data sets in and accessing them on an ongoing basis for both industry and regulator, and sustainable, that value being sustained through both improvements in environmental outcome, improvements in efficiency, and ongoing investment. The other region that we're working in the Pilbara is a much earlier stage. We've been working through that over the last year or so, starting to establish what are the science needs, what are the data needs, bringing data together. In that case, one of the real barriers to understanding what's happening in the system, it's a very arid system where much of the vegetation and therefore the habitat for the critically endangered animals that live in that region is dependent on groundwater. But mining impacts groundwater processes. Miners are legally barred from sharing their groundwater data with each other because it's anti-competitive behavior. But as a regulator, the government needs to see what's happening to the aquifer. They want to see what's happening on a landscape scale. Traditional owners in the region are very culturally associated to spring structures and permanent water flow in the landscape because it's a desert landscape. Those are very important, both socially and culturally, to the traditional owners. So they want to understand what's happening on a landscape scale. If you can't share your data, how can you actually answer that question? Might seem really obvious, but one of the first things that we calculated for the regulator was average depth to groundwater across the aquifer. Nobody had been able to do that before. It's average, such a simple calculation, but it's a thing that couldn't be done because of the 6,600 boreholes that monitor that aquifer, 60 were publicly available data. The remainder were held in private data sets. So you had an enormous amount of data about what was going on, but no ability to actually share that. Now, probably 6,000 private boreholes is much too much for the region, so it's over-monitored, so there's an efficiency for the future, but being able to move through that process. So we're seeing some real wins. We're seeing this coming into action, and we're now moving through with our partners to look at how that impacts on the more glamorous part, the flora and fauna living in that landscape. Future vision is CEIF everywhere. So thinking about areas that are, as I mentioned before, contested, economically valuable, rich in biodiversity. We look at a map of Australia and not committing to any of those spots. Those spots are kind of scattered at random, but thinking about things like new critical minerals zones being designated by the government for exploitation, renewable energy zones, ports developments, urban renewal and extension. All of those regions could benefit from CEF and the approach that we're taking there. So the vision of hub and spoke growing out from there. If you want to know more about CEF, cef.org.au, or use the little QR code that's on there that links to sort of a web portal that takes you through some of the story that I've told today. But with that, I'll acknowledge our joint venture members and back to Rosie.
That's a bit more appropriate for my height. Stop laughing, Hilary. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Owen. It's lovely to see that work shared with the audience here. And I think when Owen is talking about the vision for the future, some of those things are very close. So we have a marine wetlands example that hopefully will get funding approval on Tuesday next week. So it's not long, far off, dreamy. It's here and now. So it's very exciting. So we're going to move on to the second of this morning's presentation from Danny Kincaid. And Danny is Director of the Biological and Chemical Oceanographic Data Management Office, a disciplinary data repository supporting the academic oceanographic research community. A former marine biologist, Danny holds a master's degree in marine science and possesses more than 20 years' experience managing oceanographic data. Her current research lies at the intersection of information and oceanographic sciences, where the focus on data curation and publication using novel technologies and domain best practices facilitates open science. So absolutely perfect for this morning. Active in research and community efforts that advance the field of data management, and Danny served in a leadership capacity in related organizations, including the US Council of Data Facilities, the NSF EarthCube program, and the American Geophysical Union's informatics section. So it's with absolute delight to introduce Danny this morning with the title of her talk, Connecting and Governing Ocean Data for Sustainability, the Impacts and Challenges of Curating Oceanographic Data. So thank you, Danny. Over to you.
Okay, get situated here a moment. Thank you so much, Rosie and Hilary and Shelley, for the opportunity to be able to tell you a little bit about our story in the data management side of things. So it was incredibly inspiring and fascinating talk that Owen gave, and we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and to talk to you about this topic from the perspective of the management of oceanographic data. So using oceanography as a use case, talk about some of the challenges. I'd like to start up really high. So if you'll indulge me, we'll start up at a 30,000 foot view and we'll rapidly come down to sort of a boots on the ground from a repository perspective in oceanography. Great. So many of you know fingertip facts about the oceans, right? It covers 70% of our Earth. It is supplying nearly 50% of our oxygen. It's absorbing our CO2 that we produce. It plays a vital role in our water cycle, and as such, it's responsible for driving our climate. It is a valuable source of ecosystem services and biodiversity, right? That comparable to even the rainforests here in Costa Rica. It's also a source of food, nutrition, and security, and it contributes to our global economy, and it provides a valuable source of recreation for all of us. Highly valuable. And yet we are experiencing unprecedented change, and the oceans are in a state of, quite frankly, increasing emergency. Eutrophication is happening, ocean acidification, increasing, oh, I'm not changing the slides. There we go. Increasing temperatures are threatening coral ecosystems. We have increased variability in climate and frequency of extreme events. We have hypoxic events and overfishing, and we have some plastic pollution problems, major problems. So the large marine ecosystems are in a state of flux and threatened at this time. And we need to understand the current states and fluxes to be able to better predict rates of change and their impacts. And so it's no surprise that the oceans are one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2017, the UN's General Assembly deemed our decade now, 2020, to be the decade of the oceans. And the goal here is to allow researchers to perform better science and gain better knowledge about the oceans in order to help protect and restore these large marine ecosystems. So to achieve these goals, the Sustainability Development Goal, as well as our goals of the Ocean Decade, we're going to need researchers to have the ability to share their data, but also have access to high quality data in order to perform solution science, but also maintain discovery science as well. And so that's where the challenges associated with oceanographic data come in. There's no shortage of challenges. Emerging research practices and instrumentation are producing massive amounts of data that challenge researchers both to manage it themselves, but also share that out and discover and reuse it. Giving you two examples here, the discipline of ocean proteomics, going out and sampling the oceans for protein contents to be able to talk about or investigate what's out there fauna-wise is a relatively new technique in oceanography. It produces massive amounts of data from mass spectrometry files. On the right there, you see phytoplankton ecological instrumentation that takes high resolution images of little critters, bugs in the water, so phytoplankton, zooplankton. Massive database growing annually, currently at 7 terabytes, making it really challenging to browse these data for researchers, download, share, et cetera. Another way to drive this home in a recent article, commentary in Nature, driving home the scale of the problem for oceanography, you can see that in the last 20 years, since 2000, we have collected more oceanographic observations than in the century preceding it. These data have big data problems. They're not necessarily all big data, but they vary in variety and volume and velocity. They are relatively unshared. They are of unknown quality. When they are shared, they're often siloed in different repositories, and they tend to be unfair. So all of these challenges together make research in this space really, really difficult. And one of the more important things to keep in mind here is also that oceanographic data are highly valuable. They're collected at great cost and effort. Taking a research vessel out into the ocean is costly and challenging environmentally. And the observations that are collected cannot just be resampled the next day. That parcel of water is moving constantly. So incredibly valuable observations. And there's more to this picture as well. If we think about the researcher perspective, when they develop their hypotheses and their research projects, they're often quite complex. Oceanography is a highly heterogeneous, interdisciplinary research domain. And the the data that's needed to collect and answer those hypotheses are often quite complex and heterogeneous in file types, scale, and formats. So a single collaborative project might end up collecting a wide variety of data. And those researchers need to understand the complexities of sharing those data. And a new researcher going to seek a project's data needs to understand the distributed nature of those. So to give you an example, if we look at a research vessel on a project, single project going out to sea to collect data, they may collect physical and chemical properties in the water. They may collect molecular data on the organisms they find. And the ship is collecting data as it's steaming through the ocean. And lastly, they may collect physical samples as well. And so all of these data streams are unique and have their own repositories for curation. And so that researcher, say, looking at microbial productivity in the sediments in the ocean, will now have to share their data through multiple potentially siloed repositories. And that means that they are learning the unique formats, standards, processes, and operations of each repository they need to submit to. In addition, if you're a new researcher and you're interested in this project, you have to figure out where those data have gone to piece together the full context of why they were collected. So it's both challenging for the researcher to share, and it's challenging for a new researcher to discover. And that's not the end of it. If we think about broader context and information that's necessary to understand the full picture here, there's distributed information on the funding and the original abstract that funded that project. There's information on the researcher that sits over in ORCID. And there's also the final published paper of the results of that research project. Lots of distributed information. I hope you're getting the picture here that it's challenging on both fronts. And so this is where I want to just pause and talk about some of the solutions or the role that disciplinary repositories can provide in this space. I am representing a disciplinary repository for academic oceanographic sciences, as Rosie said, Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office, or BICO-DEMO. And what I want to talk about now is this role that repositories can fill in mitigating some of these challenges, specifically in the area of fair and emerging care. And if I leave you with one kind of idea here, it's that disciplinary repositories can fill a valuable role. They respond to the research community needs. They leverage community best practices, existing best practices and technologies to really address the I and the R in FAIR. And then there's a new role emerging with the sort of growing concern of care. So BICO-DEMO is funded by the US National Science Foundation. We're a relatively small operation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about disciplinary curation and then some of the practices that we perform as our service to researchers. So I want to start here with what disciplinary curation kind of entails. And pause for a moment to just point out our team. Our team is both part-time and full-time data professionals who also have a background in oceanography. And I think that's really critical. So they are both trained in and they've been out in the field in oceanography. They understand the instrumentation and the data streams, and they've also developed information management and data science skills. We collaborate with every individual researcher that comes to share their data with us. And the team is really critical. They do education while they work with them to share their data. And a big piece of this is that it takes time. Disciplinary curation takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. The end product is really valuable, but it's effort. And so what does disciplinary curation mean? Well, we usually apply community-accepted quality control practices. We harmonize data values inside the files. We crack open files, we look at them. This is an example of a typical data file that comes into us. And I will say, taking a moment out here, that we're primarily a very small, I often refer to us as boutique data management. All of our data are relatively discrete from small research projects that are usually 2 to 5 years. These data come in from single investigators all the way up to larger programs, but they typically come in the native environments that the oceanographers are working in. This is an Excel spreadsheet. It's got multiple tables embedded in it, images, graphs, undescribed color meaning in the file. And what our data managers will do, will apply all of these practices. We map local terms to authoritative vocabularies. We augment the files and the metadata as necessary to improve context and fitness for purpose of those data. And lastly, because we are just a small project ourselves, running on grant-sponsored funds in a 5-year cycle, we could potentially be sunsetted. So we ensure all the data that we curate on these mid timescales is archived in our national data center. So by applying all of these techniques, we harmonize data to a standardized format for tabular data. You're seeing here some photosynthetic active radiation, or PAR. And they come in like the previous slide, all messy, and we make them as harmonized and consistent as possible. And so by doing this, we're rapidly improving the I and the R in FAIR for the use of these data. And so moving on to some of the other techniques, oops, let me see. Right. So looking at discoverability. Behind the scenes, while these data are getting processed, we're also working with technologies that allow the data to be both discovered and picked up by search engines. Things like existing technologies, vocabularies like scienceonschema.org, which was, I believe, even further developed here through RDA and other community organizations like ESIP. So we leverage things like schema.org to be able to have our data picked up by search engines as broad and general as Google Dataset Search, but also more community known and community specific resources like the Ocean Data and Information System, which is an output of the IOC. And so we can either have our data show up in these really common community known resources, or lower the barrier and have our data exposed through Google Dataset Search. So we also want to meet researchers where they are. And by doing that, we improve the accessibility, the A and the I. And not every researcher that comes to us is coding savvy or technically inclined. So we expose our data in a variety of ways. They can simply go through the browser, easy web-based services to download, but we also are starting to develop notebooks for folks who want to both access and ingest the data that we have. So we're developing notebooks for each data set we have. We use known open source tools. The lower right-hand corner is something called RDA, which was developed within the US oceanographic community. It allows data to be discovered, subsetted, visualized, plotted, and downloaded in a variety of flavors. If you work in NetCDF, we have you covered. If you work in traditional tabular CSV, we can provide data to meet the needs of the researchers. And lastly, if you're really technically savvy, we have a number of APIs, and we expose our Sparkle, our RDF in a Sparkle endpoint. So if you're inclined to grab it that way, we have you covered as well. So all of these activities are sort of commonplace for meeting the needs of our researchers. And we also, to augment our metadata, to dig into the eye, we leverage the power of PIDs. We augment metadata, and we even augment our data, leveraging persistent identifiers. We pull in complementary information from external sources using this, and this also provides, as I said before, this better full picture context. So those are just typical PIDs that we use, but I'd like to kind of dig into an example here and demonstrate how we use these. Within our database, as we receive data, we often learn from the researchers this heterogeneous content. In this particular project, which is too small to see, obviously, what I want to show you is that the environmental in situ data that we curate, we also found out that there were multiple molecular genetic samples that were taken that were distributed or, excuse me, shared in a different repository. Now, we know this repository in the US, it's an NIH supported repository, the NCBI repository. And those genomic samples are given an accession, a PID. And we augment our data that we have, the in situ data, by creating a new data set that has those molecular identifiers and all of the sample metadata associated with them. So if you go to our database and you select that data set, you can see that we've put the persistent identifiers and all of the sample metadata that may or may not be sitting at the other repository, but it provides a key to go find those molecular data. And this was a critical piece for our community members. They really wanted to have both the genetics, but the in situ context in which to interpret what those expressions, those gene expressions mean. And so we provided them a way to get from our repository with the in situ information to the actual genetic sequences through the use of this PID. So that's a number of ways that as a disciplinary repository, we can add value to the data that we curate for reuse, but also we do this educational process with the researchers as well. That's sort of looking at the whole soup to nuts of FAIR. CARE, which I want to take a moment to discuss, is emerging in the repository space as obviously highly valuable, but something that really wasn't thought about before. And I'll be very transparent as a director of a repository. I didn't think we really had cause to address CARE initially. And for those of you who aren't familiar with CARE, I believe there was even sessions here during this RDA, but really looking at how to tie the indigenous heritage, cultural heritage and rights, indigenous rights of both place, culture, and artifacts to the use and the governance of data. And for me, as a director of a oceanographic repository that receives data from federal funding, initially I naively thought that all of those challenges associated with CARE would be handled upstream of the data that we receive. And this is relatively emerging, and there aren't a lot of repositories out there right now in the disciplinary repository space that are addressing CARE. And I had the good fortune of being invited to an operational working session this year, this May, trying to figure out how repositories can implement CARE practices. It was incredibly informative, and one of the pilots that was used during this working group was of indigenous marine samples that were taken at a field station in Moorea in French Polynesia. And the ability to do this was outlined very clearly for us. And so I'll dig into that in just a moment. But what I wanted to share was that initially I thought this is going to be challenging for repositories. It's sort of a new mandate. It's going to be difficult to figure out the mechanisms in which to implement the care practices. Luckily, hot off the presses this year, only weeks ago, is a publication that sort of provides a roadmap or an outline of how disciplinary repositories can implement the care practices, the care principles. So I've gone from thinking this is going to require a lot of new infrastructure. You definitely need to have FAIR in hand first, and it's going to be challenging for rapid uptake by repositories. And after this workshop, it was very clear that it's not the heaviest lift that I thought it was going to be. There is a roadmap out there, and there's a wonderful example of how to do this. The Geome repository is a metadata aggregator and augmenter that connects otherwise unknown metadata about molecular samples to their genetic sequences. So it's sort of this augmenting middleman. And it was presented as a success story for implementing care. Geome worked with an organization called Local Contexts, and please feel free to visit those links to learn more about this. It was incredibly informative for me. So the organization of Local Contexts is a platform that provides the mechanisms in which to communicate Indigenous interests, both to the community and externally to new users. And Geome was a pilot case working with this Moorea field station. And they were able to turn, back up, they were able to turn these metadata tags that were notices to end user communities about Indigenous interests. And by connecting to the community that might be interested in these data, they were able to get validation of those interests and turn the labels into, the notices into labels. These are simply communication mechanisms, and they have PIDs. They are actionable. And it's very fortunate that DataCite has worked with the local context and these communities to develop the schemas to allow these tags to continue on through, all the way through to the DOI. So this is a great success story of how Indigenous folks in Moorea, working with the researchers through the US Long-Term Ecological Research Program, can communicate out their Indigenous interests in the data that's getting collected. So sort of tying it all together, linking it together, I want to kind of leave you with this idea that repositories play a vital role here. Disciplinary repositories can use technologies, work with their communities, and leverage existing infrastructure to add value to the data, to provide FAIR data, to enable discovery and uptake, to improve fitness for purpose, and to address the sovereign rights of Indigenous people on their data. And I think that's all I have. So I thank you very much for your time.
How's that? Ooh, lordy. Right. Thank you both so much for those presentations. So we're now going to have a few questions from me while you gather your thoughts, and then we will open up to the audience. So I'm going to kick off with you, Owen. A lot of the work that we've been hearing about this week in the RDA meeting is about open data. But data security, that's a really important part of the SEAF framework. And can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. One of the things that, coming from a research background, you often leap to open? How can we make our data open? How can we make it freely available? Because it's not commercially sensitive. Once we've published, of course, we get our publication and get that data out there. And so I think when we as a research institute started on the CEF journey, we had this naively optimistic outlook that if we just built trust with industry, they would make their data, which is an environmental data set. It's a public good. It's obviously going to be wonderful to have that available to everybody and out in the open. And then we met some lawyers, and everything grinds to a halt. And so you've got this vast amount of environmental data that if you push for open, you don't get. So the aspiration of open leads to a failure to actually access the data. And if you think about fair, it's findable, accessible. So how can we get access to that data that people are unwilling to make open? And that's where we started to work with technology providers that were working in health and defense on really secure data encryption services, data tracking and security, to build a platform that allows people to take that first step of making their data accessible to be used by models, but not open, not visible. And it's not to say that that data doesn't eventually work its way through. Many of the companies that we're working with have voluntarily uploaded a lot of their archival data, their historic environmental data, which isn't commercially sensitive at this point, into the existing data repositories, and they are open and accessible. But the current decision-making data, the very latest of their data and information that sits in that secure space, developing a platform that allows access rather than openness has really moved us forward in getting the environmental and economic outcomes that we've been seeking. It also helps with some of the social outcomes, because for many of our community members that want to see the outcomes of what's this data showing us about our environment, whether that's traditional owners or local communities, they're not necessarily asking, can I see the raw data? They want to know what's happening to the environment. In Australia, we use the term reporting on country, or talking understanding country. It's how traditional owners think about land. And it's a very holistic approach. It's not about seeing that data point and having that data point be open. It's having access to the knowledge that that data point provides. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, I think that's great. And I think it's an important message for our commercial and other collaborators when working with FAIR, that it doesn't have to be open. But building on FAIR, Danny was telling us you've got to get FAIR right before you can move to care. And Danny, next one's for you, so grab the microphone. Looking at care, you told us some of the recent work that you've seen, and I was really thrilled with the comment that the heavy lifting wasn't as much as you'd anticipated. I think this is something that's really front of mind for us back in Australia. I wasn't quite sure if I could photograph your slides from here, but I need a copy. But what I'd love you to expand on right now is, what would you say is the number one challenge for your boutique repository, another lovely term, in advancing the care agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that like many other aspects of the socio-technical sort of pipeline of delivering data, is that the technical pieces are not insurmountable. It's the cultural shift in normalizing the need for them and funding. So a lot of these smaller academic repositories that do provide these types of services run on 5-year, grant-sponsored cycles. And so it's really challenging to implement new and emerging practices without the support behind it. So I would say, support is key. But until I received an invitation to participate in this workshop, I hadn't been even aware or felt the need to address care, thinking that the data types that we curated were not even couldn't possibly fall under a need for care. And so I think some of it's awareness, some of it's funding, and then just the technical infrastructure is there. The use of persistent identifiers and the data site infrastructure. I think it's just uptake on the funding side and getting it into the priorities of repositories.
And so often we find it's the social connection, which is so much part of the RDA story there as well, that you're highlighting. So sticking with you for a minute, Danny. Here's a nice curly question. What percentage of oceanographic data do you believe is currently available to researchers? And if you think you're getting off easily, we're going to you next.
Well, for this has been fascinating, and I'll also give a little. I'll be a little transparent here too. It's been wonderful to be able to speak with Owen through this process of planning for this talk, and so my lens is strictly academic and academic research, and in sort of having this conversation about oceanographic data, and I realized how narrow a view just that academic research piece is relative to the entire corpus of data being collected either from industry, agencies, and just the act of commerce and ships of opportunity traversing the oceans produce so much data. Academically, we're in relatively good stead, and I look to Owen to see if for validation here that I would say better than 50% of academic data is shared in some way. There's a cultural change that the data is being or there's an expectation to share data, make it accessible in some way. Researchers are also good about even if they're protective of their data, they're collaborative and will share data, but the vast amount of data that's collected in the oceans that is either commercial or private, as Owen was describing, it's entirely unknown to me. So I would pass the mic over.
And I think you're right, Danny. There's a really good culture, and we often point at the marine community as being an exemplar of best practice of sharing that really expensive to collect, hard to collect, as you said in your presentation, oceanographic data. So there's an element of good practice in the academic world where research data goes through into national and international repositories, and global circulation models draw on really large-scale collections of collaborative research data. But it is that gap of the other data. The other data that's generated through commercial means and defense and other aspects that doesn't become available. And I think we sometimes are quite blinkered in our looking at the world that we live in. So in the academic world, we think, wouldn't it be great if we could get all the academic data to be in a coherent and available repository or way to access it? And it would, but it wouldn't be all the data. And in the government sector, there's the notion of bringing together the data, but it wouldn't be all the data. And equally, industry or commercial data isn't all the data either. But I mentioned in my presentation, when we did this work in Western Australia, we found that over 90% of the survey effort is conducted by private entities. Some of that data does make its way into public repositories, but most of it doesn't. And we thought, well, maybe that's a strange, unique thing about terrestrial data in mining regions in Western Australia. And we looked at the marine data sets and found similarly, excluded what we call unicorn projects, some of the multi-billion-dollar offshore oil and gas ventures that generated vast data sets that just dwarf everything else. And it's still that sort of 90%. We thought, well, is it true internationally as well? And just last week, I was meeting with the Crown Estates in the UK, and they found that, yeah, that in the areas that they're responsible for in the territorial waters of the UK, they're seeing about an 85 to 90% bias towards commercially generated data versus government or research generated data. So there's that vast body of work out there. And I think sometimes in the academic community, we go, well, it's not as good as our data, and it's, depending on the measure, it probably isn't. It's not, a very strictly designed survey protocol but it's high volume data, ships of opportunity. It's a really good example. But yeah, they're not doing a linear transact, but they are traversing the ocean. So you've got this opportunity to access things that, if we don't raise our eyes and look at what's out there beyond our silos, we can spend a lot of time working in the silo to try and break down the barriers inside the silo and not realize that we're still in the silo.
Thanks. So that's future. Well, not future challenges. It's challenges we've got to tackle next. Yeah. So at this point in the conversation, what I'd like to do is to throw open to the audience. Any questions for either of our speakers? And Claudia, you were fast. I think you need to. Wonderful. And then we'll have another question.
Thank you. Yeah, I was prompting my muscles to raise my arm. My name is Claudia. I'm from Brazil, and I love both presentations. And I have a question for each of you. Danny, speaking from a boutique point of view, are you preparing yourself for a day when the boutique will be overwhelmed by customers and too many products? What could you do? Okay. And Owen, you talked about scalability, repeatability. What are lessons we should learn of what not to do to become more scalable and more repeatable? Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we're looking at scalability in both cases there. So Danny, we'll kick off with you.
That was a wonderful question.
I think it's one of these.
Yeah. As a small disciplinary repository, just in academia, we are already overwhelmed by the volume of data coming in. So as our National Science Foundation funds more interdisciplinary and complex projects, they produce just this high variety of data that take a long time to curate well. I think that having expertise, but leveraging emerging technologies like AI to streamline some of our really routine operations, we're already doing that. I think that federating repositories for better integration of data across, I sat in a panel yesterday about integration across data commons. I think that that's really going to be key in the future, but it's trying to figure out a successful business model for these small data sets is still challenging for us today. Yeah.
So things not to do if you're trying to be scalable. The first one is a really obvious one, but it does bear saying. Don't compete. Don't compete with each other. One of the temptations that all small organizations, and we're all small organizations on a global scale, we're very small. The temptation is to reach outside your specialty, to do that thing, to move out of the boutique and into sort of the general store. So build partnerships, don't compete. We lean very heavily on that SAFE framework, the shared analytics framework for the environment, to talk to partners about what is your role within the data supply chain. It's not our role to collect the data. It's not our role to curate the data. It's not, your role is this, and you do that really well, and we're really dependent on you. Can you do that better? And how can we help you do that better? The partnership we have with ARDC is a great example of that. We've built strong partnerships with industry, but had a weakness in the fact that we were on commercial cloud and not really accessible to the research community. ARDC, as our national research infrastructure, digital infrastructure provider, has that network and has that capability. So let's not build over them or alongside them, build with them, build together, and link what's there. So that was the first one, don't compete. Second one is don't reinvent the wheel. We spend a lot of time sharing the journey that we've been on with other organizations that are on similar journeys. We learn as much from others as we give out often in those conversations, because people have got bits of the puzzle already in place. So don't compete, don't reinvent the wheel. And I think don't be afraid of commercial and industrial. Walk into those partnerships with your eyes wide open. They are commercial entities, not the the government-funded infrastructure that many of us represent. But they do have technology that can shortcut the journey that we're on. So 3 steps in that: don't compete, don't reinvent the wheel, and shake hands with the devil, talk to industry.
Thanks, Owen. Now, question over there, go for it.
Hello, Marek Cebecar, Herowski Institute, Czech Academy of Sciences. I also have questions for both of you. So, Owen, there was already touch of it. Military sensitive data, is it included in your SIEV system? Because there is involvement of nuclear power submarine port, and that could be necessary to include it at some point. That's a question for you. And for Danny, you mentioned the complex data, very diverse in terms of size, flow, and also subdomains. Do you communicate with global bioimaging community? Because we are dealing with exactly the same problem when we are imaging biological objects, but not only in a clinical imaging, in medical imaging, we are dealing that we need to combine it with omics data and a lot of social data and other issues. So we are developing file formats which can handle it. I'm not saying that we are at the end of the journey, but it would be nice to share the experience and the effort.
Okay, so we had a couple of questions there.
Military data. Yeah.
You good?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Up here on the stage, there's a lot of reverb, so didn't quite catch your question. But looking at military data, so in our Coburn Sound case, one of the projects that's being developed is being developed by Defence, and so there is that integration of Defence generated data into the space. So it's environmental data that's generated by Defence rather than any of their engineering. I suppose dredging channels is engineering, but yeah, there is that security, and it was one of the big thresholds for us to pass in terms of being able to apply SIEF in the Coburn Sound region, was getting the tick to be a secure provider, holder of that data that's generated by Defence. So it is there. It is integrated. It's less relevant in some of the other patches of our work. So in the Pilbara, there's not a lot of Defence infrastructure, but the capability to include it is there. Yeah.
With respect to unique and challenging data types, right? Imaging is one of the biggest for oceanography. There are so many facets of that file type that are still emerging. So the slide that I showed with the high resolution, small cell count type data sets, that's just sort of one facet. We also get holographic. We get sort of born digital mineral model, just you name it. And they're used both taxonomically, a wide variety of uses. So I think I would lean back to something Owen said, in that collaborating with other entities and repositories that are either experiencing these challenges or developing best practices for this. So we engage in a number of forums like RDA to be able to access people who are going through similar challenges. So I would love to talk more about this. Within oceanography, there are on the academic side, there are small pockets of researchers that are coming together to try and develop these use cases to have the best practices development. So from the taxonomic determination, we engaged in a US forum that is looking at best practices there. But to the degree that we can get out into the broader global community, we will and try to. One of the goals and endeavors working with researchers is to elevate our data into these larger global ocean observing systems, or the GOOS, where these small data can contribute to very big data projects like global circulation models and things like that. So we can have these small, well-curated data that contribute up into these broader efforts. Imaging data and challenging formats are, no exception. So to the degree that we can collaborate, not reinvent the wheel and not compete, we always do. Yeah. And so I would love to talk more about it offline.
Thank you. Now, do we have
Yeah.
further questions from the audience?
Well, I'd like to read the ones from Zoom, if that's okay.
Yes,
To give our
please.
online participants, I'm told I have to stand up, so. Owen, the first one is from you, from Louis, but I believe you may have addressed it. I'm going to read it anyway, and then see, but I think you've covered a bit of it. Can you further discuss how the technical dimension of CEIF, i.e. encrypted data flows, foster greater civilian military research and develop partnership, particularly encouraging the defence military to engage in open science initiatives? What are your experiences in collaborating with your defence sector in doing your respective projects?
So I think we touched on that with the answer to the previous question. In the Cobra Sound exemplar, Defence is one of the proponents working in the system. They're at an early stage at this point, so they've ticked off that they're happy with the security to be on board. They haven't moved any data or processing on board yet because they're not quite at that point of the project. So that pathway is open. I think reflecting on previous experience rather than my current role, defence agencies manage huge amounts of land and are actually really quite forward thinking in terms of their environmental practice, because they have training estates and defence estates. Defence estates globally are a really important part of environment and conservation, and are quite forward looking. That's their environmental data, not their defence strategic data. So I think there's real opportunity. The ability to share in an encrypted way is as relevant to them as it is to other industries. Defence isn't really a special case. They're just an organization that has security concerns. Our global corporates have security concerns too.
Thanks.
Rosie, a quick one it's still from the chat. Yeah, a quick one from for Danny. Do you use British Oceanographic Data Centre parameter usage vocabulary when you curate your data, or do you have your own ontology?
We do have our own ontology, but we do leverage BODC's NERC vocabulary for what we tend to do is accept the local terms of every researcher that, that it's important to retain their context for their data. And we map to NERC's vocabulary. So a little bit of both. So yes.
And the last one, and then I pass back to the floor here. I think it's for you, Owen. It seems that transparency of results is a bit of an issue if 90% of the data is generated by industry is accurate. If a model says we should move fishing from one area to another, is it possible for academia to review the fidelity or trustworthiness of the raw data that led to the recommendation, even if they need to sign an NDA? Otherwise, as a citizen, I'd be a bit worried that closed data contain some biases that lead to bad recommendations, or that they may be in the interest of the data producers.
Yeah, that's a really, really important question. And I think there are a number of safeguards in place for that. One of the aspects is that much of the data that is collected for legally mandated processes. So environmental approval or regulatory compliance. So that data is collected to defined standards while it is held as private. When it's submitted to the government, an officer of the company, somebody in the sort of C-suite management of that company has to sign that it is meets the standards. It's the full data set. You know, they've got a declaration about the data quality that goes to the regulator, so to the government, and they, you know, there are steep fines and prison sentences associated with not complying to that. That's not our world, that's the regulator's world. So we accept data that is compliant and is signed off as compliant as being, you know, there's a level of veracity to that data. They're standing in, placing themselves potentially in breach of legal conditions. Absolutely. If companies then are willing to allow review, that is possible, but that would be on a case-by-case basis. So the models running on the encrypted data, the person running the model cannot see the data. That's the nature of the encryption. That's why people will put their data in there. But there's no reason that you can't then do an unencrypted version if someone was questioning a particular part of that work. There is a trust aspect to it. And I think it's really important in terms of our structure, the way we've set up SAFE, that the data is coming from the different sources to an independent organization. And then that decision-making is still done. We're not saying do X or do Y. We're saying here is the best evidence base to make decisions on. So we're not driving the decision. We're providing an improved evidence base for decision. Yeah.
Thanks. A really great question there. Now, we are coming up to the end of a fantastic session. I am aware we've got one further audience question here. So your final quick closing remark there, closing question there.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Bob Downs from Columbia University. So I'm really interested in seeing how you're getting all these data from industry in Western Australia. And I'm wondering in terms of the use of this information by industry, not just by the government, and also how you were able to determine that use, to monitor it or measure it even. Thanks.
That's quite a big question,
Yeah.
Bob.
Yeah.
Quick answer, Owen, and then we might be resuming over coffee as well there.
In terms of monitoring the use of the data, so what we do is for organizations that want to use the shared data, they get a virtual machine in the secure platform. And so while we don't see what they do with the data, because that's their business, not ours, we know how much time they're using on their virtual machine. So that's a way we can monitor use, but there are other metrics. As Rosie said, we can probably pick that up later.
Great, thanks, Owen. So thank you for joining this morning, Danny. Thank you both for your fantastic talks. Please join me in thanking this morning's speakers for a fabulous session.